Moving on. Brandon Eiler wants to know, how do you defend the face, I guess he means fact, that a lot of founding fathers were slave owners? He had two questions back to back. They both sounded a little challenging, so I'll deal with them both. How do you defend the fact that a lot of the founding fathers were slave owners? Well, first of all, you don't really defend the fact. I don't know really what you want me to say there. Brandon, would you like me to say that that slave owning is wrong? It is wrong. It's a moral wrong. Unfortunately, it wasn't considered to be a moral wrong at the time, and we have the benefit of a couple hundred years of advancement of civilization to be able to make that judgment. And the reason I'm saying this is not to defend slavery. On the contrary, what I'm saying though is that if you looked at the time of the Constitutional Convention, or even earlier with the Founding Fathers, what you find is you think that our world today, modern Americans look at it as you're either free or you're a slave. You are either completely free or you're in bondage. That's a modern way of looking at things. At the time of the Constitutional Convention and the Founding Fathers, there was slavery, which was practiced around the world. There was indentured servitude, which is a form of slavery. There were internships that approached indentured servitude, and nobody really was free in the sense that we really understand it. Almost everybody was beholden to somebody else, and very large legal penalties and legal constraints on their behavior. It was a spectrum. So, number one, there is no defense of slavery. Owning somebody else is indefensible morally. However, it is a childish and puerile thing to apply the standards of 200 years to previous standards. And I'll give you two examples that you might find interesting. We may discover, I suspect we will discover, that animals have an intelligence far higher than we gave them credit for. Far higher. We may discover one day that cats and dogs have personalities and individuality. We may discover that they have thoughts, and we may discover that they have thoughts of escape. You will then be judged by that standard because you kept pets. Some people will hear this and say, I'm equating slavery with keeping cats. You're missing the point. The point I'm trying to make is that at the time of slavery, with slavery rampant throughout the world, people did not consider them to be human. It's only through the adventure and the blood of testing that idea in the crucible of history that we learn that they are, in fact, people. I have often I'll talk about abortion with people, and I'll basically say, how many of you who are pro-choice out there were in favor of slavery during the Civil War? And none of them are, obviously, nor should they be. And I'll say, okay, but think about this. The Civil War basically, I'm not going to get into this business about states' rights. It was the states' rights to own slaves. I know my history. So the question about the Civil War was very simple. If slaves were property, then the North is wrong. Then it is the War of Northern Aggression. If slaves are property, then the North, the Union, had no business going down there in violation of the Constitution in the previous 80 years of history and taking away their property. They had as little right to go down there and fight a war over slavery as they did to fight a war to liberate people's horses or steal their cotton, if slaves are property. However, if slaves are people, then there is a moral code that transcends the political code. There is natural law that says that people shall not be held in slavery. You cannot murder people. You can't sell them, can't buy them, you can't breed them, you can't split their families. It's a moral imperative. It's morally wrong. Doesn't matter what the law says. It is a natural law violation. And so if slaves are people, then the South is wrong. So the Civil War issue depends on whether or not slaves are people. Turns out that they are. So there you go. And I say that to pro-choice crowd only to say that for those of you who are accusing people who are trying to prevent this procedure, they are trying to prevent this procedure for the same reason that you are against slavery. They perceive these fetuses to be people. If the cells in your body, if you claim them as just being cells, there's your body. First of all, it doesn't have your DNA. It's not your body. It's not your body. It's different DNA than you. So they're on fairly good footing scientifically, these pro-lifers. But they are doing the same thing that you would have done in the Civil War. They are trying to defend human life. All of a sudden it starts to get a little more clear doesn't it? So I think you just have to understand that the founding fathers, some of them were slave owners. Slavery was not something that they invented, Brandon. It was something they inherited. You inherited a bunch of other assumptions too. It may turn out that the global warming people are right. I doubt it. But it may turn out to be true. And if it turns out to be true, and the worst case scenario is true, and it turns out that the planet is going to burn and our children are going to burn and drown, then if you are a person who knows this, if you are a global warming supporter, and you drive a car, you are no morally different than a slaveholder. You are doing something that you know is morally reprehensible. You do it because it's convenient for you economically. If you believe in global warming, I don't care if your car gets 30 miles to the gallon. If you are burning carbon, you're making the situation worse. You're informed of it. You know what's going on. And the reason you're doing it is because it is a convenient thing for you to get into your car and go to the 7-Eleven. And so if you believe in global warming and you drive a car, you are in the exact same moral position as a person who held slaves. You are doing something that advances your economic interests in contravention of what you know to be morally correct. So there you go. It's no different. The consequences are higher because we're talking about people, not Priuses, but your actions are the same. You know it's wrong. You know it's contributing to a problem. You know it's contributing to a problem that is going to cost the planet its entire life, and you do it anyway. The only people who are in a position to lecture about global warming are people who live off the grid on bicycles, who basically live without electricity, live without cars, live without anything. Those people I think are wrong. I disagree with them, but I respect them. I do not respect the people who prance around with this unearned moral superiority talking about things like global warming while they drive their cars. I don't care how many miles per gallon it gets. People talk about, it's a Prius. It's an electric car. I drive a Volt. I drive an electric car. I'm not contributing to the carbon of the planet. You idiot. Where do you think the electricity comes from? The electricity comes from either coal or oil or a nuclear powered plant. Chances are, frankly, if you have an electric car in this country, very likely you have a coal burning car. So you don't get off the hook. You don't get to preen and moralize and put yourself into a situation where you get to show everybody how much better you are. I'm not going to buy it. You're stuck. You're just trapped. You don't get to walk away on top of this little pink cloud of narcissism and self-aggrandizement. Right? So, if you don't burn a gram of carbon and you live in the woods with algae cakes, congratulations, you are morally consistent. I'm morally consistent too because I don't think there's anything to it. That's why I drive a big-ass car. So, when you talk about slavery and you talk about a world where this was inherited, and virtually around the world, that's how you defend it. I still think they're wrong. I still think it was an evil thing to do. I still think the idea that you could be a person who could walk through a field or ride through a field and whip other people with a whip and separate them from their families and put up with their wailing and crying, I think that's morally reprehensible. I think there's something wrong with you. I think you're evil, and I think you deserved everything you got. But I'm not so puerile as to say I'm going to judge you by the standards of the 21st century. I don't want to be judged by the standards of the 24th century because I don't know what crimes I'm committing. Although I suspect those people probably did. And Brandon has another question right behind it, so I'll take it because it's, I don't know, it just seemed like a 1-2 punch. If conservatives believe that life is sacred, then why do they support the death penalty? Well, Brandon, it's because conservatives, unlike liberals, understand the difference between cause and effect. It's really pretty much that simple. Conservatives understand that sometimes a cause precedes an effect. In fact, it always precedes an effect. That's why it's called the cause. Cause, effect. Do I walk down the street and just shoot people because I don't like them? No. Am I in favor of shooting somebody who comes through my window at 2 o'clock in the morning? Yes. Why? Because the cause of you coming into my window has set up a situation where I have plentiful evidence that this may not turn out to be a good operation for me. There's plentiful evidence that I might be murdered in my sleep or that my family will be murdered in their sleep. And so therefore, because of the actions that you took, Your cause has set up a string of effects. You are now the initiator of everything that goes downstream from that point. So if you didn't want to get shot, you probably shouldn't have come through my window, right? Did I go through your window? No. You know why? Because I don't want to get shot. So conservatives can determine the difference between cause and effect, and we can set up a moral code that basically says that if you let people alone, because we all like to be left alone, then you can leave people alone so long as they are willing to pay for the effects of the causes that they create. Now, if we believe that life is sacred, in other words, pro-life, the question we get is, how is it that you're fighting for the rights of this fetus, which isn't really a full person, but you're perfectly willing to put into the electric chair a 35-year-old man who is in fact a full person? You hypocrites. The fetus, or the baby, or the child, or the infant, or the victim of the crime has done nothing. They are morally innocent. They are pristine. When a person makes a decision that has an effect, they are responsible for those actions. And if you make a choice to take somebody's life in such an egregious fashion that it is no longer the heights of passion, we make exceptions. And we should make exceptions for hot-blooded murder. You walk in and see your wife in bed with another guy and you pull out a gun and shoot that guy, you don't get the death penalty, because it's understandable to people, especially conservatives, that we are all made out of flawed materials that often do stupid things. But if you cold-bloodedly plan the execution of somebody, or if you take a 14-year-old girl or 3 14-year-old girls and you drug them and you put them in your van and you take them out into the woods someplace and you spend 3 or 4 months raping them despite their screams, despite their protests, despite their begging and their pleading, and you murder them or you don't or whatever, you have so far violated the boundaries of humanity. I'm not talking about human behavior, and I'm not talking about the consequences to society. You have so far violated the idea that you are a human being who is capable of being left alone to take your own actions. You have gone so far off of that island that you are going to pay the consequences. Now, for those of you who say the death penalty doesn't deter anything, nonsense. It absolutely deters murder. It deters murder because large numbers of people don't want to do the most heinous things in society because they fear being put to death, but it absolutely deters the murder of the persons who are put to death. I forget the name of the guy, Danny something, in Gainesville, Florida, when I got back there in 1992. The Gainesville murders, I've forgotten his name. Somebody will show it to me in a minute in the comment section. 5 students over the course of 4 or 5 days were murdered by this guy. And I don't mean just murdered. They were filleted. They were their intestines were spread across the interior of the apartment like art. They were massacred. They were butchered. Think about what it takes to do that to somebody. Now, as we found out, after this guy had killed those 5 people, taken 5 lives, destroyed the lives of every one of the people who those lives touched, destroyed the lives of their parents. Their parents were never the same. Neither were their brothers and sisters, never the same. Neither were the people that lived in those apartments. Neither were the people, all the young ladies especially, that went home from college. Forget about the fact that their college plans were disrupted and that it certainly cost some of them a chance to graduate. Just the fact that they'll never feel safe again, that their security, their emotional securities took all of this stuff. He took all of this guy, Danny, whatever his name was. Now, the thing that's so interesting is he'd murdered his father several years earlier. He'd killed him in cold blood. And he was sent to prison for a couple of years, and he was released. He went out and murdered more people. The death penalty deterred that guy. It would have deterred him. But it didn't. And so what you are basically saying is, Brandon, is that human life is the most precious, I don't want to say a commodity because it's not a commodity. It's the most precious state of existence on the earth. And it will be protected with the worst penalty we have. We basically are saying, as conservatives, as people who back the death penalty, this is the most horrible thing we can do to you. It is the most deterrent. It is the thing that most people fear more than anything. And so if it deters some percentage of people because it is the thing they fear the most, then that saves lives of people who have not committed the action. They are downstream of the event. It has saved innocent lives. Danny Rawling, thank you very much, Patty. If this guy had been executed for the murder of his father, those 5 kids would be alive today. And frankly, if people were killed with more, if this deterrent were more enforced, we would have less of it. And we know this to be true. We know it to be true. Why is it? I was always so interested in watching, old westerns where you'd see a guy being hanged for stealing a horse. So, Jesus, can't hang the guy. He just stole a horse. Didn't even kill the horse. Stole the horse. How's this possible? Why are they doing that? Well, he's being hanged as a horse thief because he didn't just steal that man's horse. He stole his life. Didn't steal his property, stole his life. That horse was necessary to pull that plow. Without that plow, he's going to starve. That horse was necessary to get to the market. That horse was necessary to get his kids to medical care. That horse was necessary for him to survive. And this guy stole the means of his survival. He basically murdered that guy. It became clear to me after a while. You get into things like this and you start, what do people expect us to say? Do they expect us to say, man, I love watching them burn. I love the smell of them in the morning. It's disgusting. It's a horrible thing to do. It is supposed to be horrible. And they fear it. Ted Bundy was terrified in the final weeks of his life. That makes me happy. That makes me happy on a purely emotional level. That makes me happy. He deserved to be terrified. And a society that understands that there are consequences to your actions, and that by eliminating the consequences to the actions, we will eventually cause so much to get out of whack that we'll eventually eliminate the freedom in the first place, which is what we do, has no problem saying things like this. Of all the sentences I ever heard about, I think the one that was probably the best, the most interesting to me anyway, just because it seems so brutal, and yet it was so morally clear to me, was the sentence that was given to the murderers that were behind the story The Changeling, the movie with Angelina Jolie, directed by Clint Eastwood. Didn't get a lot of play. It was based on a real kidnapping about a guy who kidnapped a bunch of kids, took them out into his farm, murdered them. I don't know, raped them probably too. Do you know what that guy was sentenced to? Think about this for a second. Apparently, the judge sentenced him. And I don't remember if it was 1 year or 2, but the judge basically said, I hereby sentence you to 1 year of solitary confinement in the state penitentiary, at which point, after the end of 1 year, you will be taken out and hanged by the neck until you are dead. And I thought, why would you do that? He said, the judge basically said, I want you to experience what those people experienced. Justice calls for you not only to be humanely eliminated from this population, but justice demands that you experience what you inflicted, that you fully understand what you did. And so basically the judge said, we're going to give you a year to know that you're going to be killed, and then we're going to kill you. So you get to experience something that those kids out there experienced. They knew that they were going to die, and they lived in terror, and that's what you did to other people, and now you are going away. But you're going to know what you did. Now, is that cruelty or is it justice? It's both.